exists in, quote, inventing a people who are missing. He means precisely this. The collective which Kafka invokes in his novels and stories, that strange group of animals, ascetics, messengers, bureaucrats and judges, forms the contours of a social body without a discourse. Kafka's writing then draws upon affects or becomings which do not correspond to any kind of personal identity or sense of belonging. This is not to insist on the cliched image of Kafka as a lonely soul. When he famously wrote in a letter to Felice Bauer that, "I doubt I am a human being," we can read this not simply or primarily as an expression of psychological isolation, but as an indication that his inner life was composed of feelings and sentiments at odds with every available account of human personhood. The real originality of Deleuze and Guattari's reading, then, is that they insist that Kafka's existential suffering is redeployed in his creative works through a kind of depersonalized and dehumanized subjectivity that maps out an entirely unprecedented social and political space. We should thus resist reading Kafka as a tragic case, an author of intimate misfortune, whose novels and stories can be deciphered by reference to his private sense of despair and emotional pain. This is not to say that Deleuze and Guattari omit a reading of Kafka's diaries and letters. On the contrary, they insist that these form a central component of what they call his writing machine. Kafka's stories and novels are composed of movements, stops and starts, flights and escapes, countered by blockages, impasses, and dead ends. The movement of Joseph K. through the labyrinthine court system in the trial can be regarded like the movement of a rat through a maze, not in terms of a search for ultimate meaning or truth, but in terms of a life process which becomes blocked only to reassert itself through creative lines of escape. As Joseph K. becomes more desperate, he becomes more rat-like, and thus becomes capable of expressing an impersonal and non-human vitality. The failure of Kafka's protagonists to find any resolution to their predicaments can thus be reread as an assertion of the essential tenacity of life in the face of what might trap it. And the greatest traps for Kafka were those social and familial categories that crowded in on him: son, father, husband, Jew. The single creative imperative Kafka follows in his writing is, don't get trapped. This is exemplified in the notoriously unfinished and discontinuous character of his oeuvre, but more importantly, it also explains the role his personal writings play in relation to his creative works. The letters and diaries offers us a picture of a man trapped by neurosis and guilt, but they also allow us to see Kafka's works as the development of a creative trajectory that burrows a line of escape from this intolerable situation. Deleuze and Guattari thus contend that the letters and diaries are like reservoirs of pathological feeling which drive the writing machine forward. This is less a matter of hermeneutics, then, a search for meanings, than of pragmatics, the evaluation of use and action. The writing of Beckett, Massock, and Kafka springs from an ability to use the process of literary creativity in ways related to their personal biography, but in no sense reducible to it. Use here does not correspond to any freely calculating subjectivity, but to one forged in the cramped spaces of compulsion and illness. What the literary clinic offers, then, is a sort of revival of the figure of the author, but this is not at the expense of the impersonality of the text, since we can insist on the fundamental impersonality, even inhumanity, of the affects which make up authorial sensibility. The author functions as both a receiver and a transmitter of ways of feeling, living and speaking, which belong to no recognizable social or psychological convention, but rather to the outer limits of an experience that reaches us like a message from the future. As D.H. Lawrence once wrote of Melville, quote, "His human emotional self is almost played out. He is abstract, self-analytical and abstracted, and he is more spellbound by the strange slidings and colliding of matter than by the things men do. His bodily knowledge moves naked, a living quick among the stark elements. For with sheer physical vibrational sensitiveness, like a marvellous wire station, he registers the effects of the outer world. And he records also, almost beyond pain or pleasure, the extreme transitions of the isolated, far-driven soul, the soul which is now alone, without any real human contact. End quote. Melville here is less a personality than a recording machine, registering the burden of social and linguistic convention, but also transmitting the signals of a liberated sensibility, a kind of health to come, which we are as yet too weak to embody. A literary symptomatology may thus be said to diagnose the insufficiencies of what we call health and normality, sickness and pathology. The author can be located in none of these categories, but in an indistinct zone between them, neither pathological nor normal, nor abnormal, but anomalous, a producer of new norms, new values, new ways of living. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Aidan, for that. Questions, responses, reflections? I think I'll start off with a very basic one. You've said that your talk this evening was a reinterpretation of your book.
Yeah, no, my book, it was my PhD research, and I kind of wanted to capture, because no one had written on it, I wanted to write, I'm going to put everything that Deleuze says on this topic. And it was very much, Deleuze says this, Deleuze says that, and I was very willing to get at his meaning. In my talk tonight, I was, I guess, freer. I wasn't too concerned with being entirely exact with what Deleuze actually said on the topic, but extrapolating from it. Because, the reason I did that is because Deleuze never elaborated on his notion of the critical and the clinical beyond a book of essays, and they're quite fragmentary. But nevertheless, it is a concern that stuck with him throughout his career. From his very earliest books to his final piece of writing, it's a concern. But he never really sets it out. So I guess, whereas in my PhD I was trying to write what Deleuze would have written, what I would like to do now that I've done that, is to do something more Deleuzian and just take what Deleuze says and run with it. Deleuze has this nice image, of how he reads philosophers, which is taking them from behind and giving them a monstrous baby that they would be horrified by. And this is, no one really does this with Deleuze, because people worship Deleuze, as we rightly should, because he was this great philosopher, and they try to delineate exactly what he meant. But of course that's not a Deleuzian way of reading a philosopher. A Deleuzian way of reading a philosopher would be to enrage him and present him with a monstrous thing that he nevertheless would have to own, because he can't deny what he wrote. But I'm not claiming that I've done that tonight, but that was more of my goal.
Okay. What would a Deleuzian literary criticism look like?
Well, hopefully I've given you some indication of that.
Yeah, but what I mean is, what would it look like if you had a text, say you had a class and you had a text and you wanted them to do it, how would you go about it?
It's a difficult one, because the way Deleuze reads texts, in a way he's not too concerned with meaning. He's concerned with what the text achieves from a certain conception of subjective contact with a creative force. So in that sense, the first thing to do would be to take Deleuze's statement that the question is not what a text means, but what a text does, and try to work from there. So what does the text do? And who is it doing it for? Is it for the author? Is it for the reader? So it would involve putting the text in a context that's based in Deleuze's own philosophy. Now that's a difficult one because you're teaching an entire philosophy of subjectivity and creativity there.
Could you do it with any text?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, there are a number of authors that I think you could do, like Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka. What they do is they read everything he wrote, including his personal writings, and they ask, they would take, say, one of the animal stories, Metamorphosis, or a report to an academy, and say, what is that text doing in relation to the rest of Kafka's writing machine? Right? So they consider Kafka's whole work to be this machine with functions, and each part plays a role. So to do an analysis of, a Deleuzean analysis of a text, I think you would have to read everything. Yeah.
You could say that about any good criticism. You should ideally be able to read anything. But I have in mind somebody whose writings you might have come across, a friend of mine in Paris, Marie-Dominique Garnier.
Yeah.
Who is somebody that tends to find fault with supposedly Deleuzean critics saying, it may be using some concepts of Deleuze, bring them to bear on literary text, and as we know for Deleuze, you can't first find a concept, but it's not Deleuzean writing. There's nothing Deleuzean about the way it operates, the way it performs things, precisely. And if you know writing, you will know what I mean, because she does really, her own texts are kind of writing machines in that sense. That sort of latch on to the text, whatever text that she analyzes. In really great ways, actually, and it's very innovative with language, and it's something which is quite precisely rejuvenating in terms of it sets up a machine from the text, which is not about listing meaning from the text. It ends up doing so in a roundabout way through the performance, which is arguably Deleuze's performance, and occasionally using concepts precisely, but with a language that really does try to sort of revolutionize the way you read text.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting too if you look at how Deleuze approaches different authors. So for example, if you contrast with Deleuze's book on Proust with his book on Kafka, he's saying it's different things. The author wants to do something different, and I guess one of the things that Deleuzians do is that they take the book on Proust and say this applies to all of literature. But Deleuze never says that it applies to all of literature. He says it applies to Proust, and Proust is doing something specific. So this is what I kind of mean when I say reintroducing the author, biographical elements. That a Deleuzian reading of a text would have to do that.
Well, also different periods as well, you could argue.
Those biographical elements, are they more sort of psychobiography, or are they social biography, or are they both?
Well, they would be both, I guess, yeah. I mean, when they talk about Kafka's life, they ask why he didn't get involved. They ask about his relationship to political movements at the time and why he didn't really align himself with any political movement. And they say that this is not because he was apolitical, which is what you might think, but because his writing was a form of politics. Already. So in that sense, you would have to consider the social context, and obviously, from my clinical perspective, a sort of psychology. One author I would like to explore more in terms of applying a Deleuzean analysis of this sort would be Malcolm Lowry, the alcoholic, the English writer who wrote Under the Volcano. Because it's very interesting. Just if you look at use the idea of the machine. I mean, Lowry had this thing. He drank so much that he was in serious ill health towards the end of his life. But he designed this method where he could write and drink, where he tied a strap he kind of put a bottle in his hat and tied a strap, so he could just pull here and the bottle would go up like that. So it was like, it's literally